This is Covenant Eyes TV, helping you to stay safe and pure online. How do we teach our children healthy sexuality in an over-sexualized culture, especially if they've already been exposed to pornography on the internet? Today we're talking to Brad Hambrick. Brad is the pastor of counseling at Summit Church in North Carolina. He is the chief editor for the Journal of Counseling and Discipleship and a council member of the Biblical Counseling Coalition. Brad received a Master's of Divinity in Biblical Counseling from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and after that a THM in Applied Theology. Today he's helping us to understand how to approach teaching sexuality to our children with a special attention to the issue of pornography online. We know that pornography is just everywhere on the internet today. It's all over the place. It's so easy to be accessed, and a lot of parents know that. A lot of parents know how easy it is to come by. And so parents are wondering, especially as their kids are young, they're wondering, I want to lay a good groundwork here to not only prevent access to pornography, but I also want to prepare my children well. I want to lay the groundwork for this sexualized world that they're about to be more and more exposed to only as they get older. So what are some good ways, some principles that we can give parents to lay that groundwork?
It's a needed subject, and it is an awkward subject.
Yeah.
And I don't think there is any way for us as parents to think about talking about sex with our kids that is not awkward. And in generations prior, it may have been that if you just had the talk about the birds and the bees, and they knew the mechanics of sex,
Right.
that you had done everything that you needed to do for your children up until premarital counseling. Now, that's probably an overstatement, but in a day and age where pornography and sexting and a sexualized culture is as strong as it is, I don't think we can serve our kids well by merely having that conversation at this age.
Right.
Now, if parents ask me, what are the most important things that we can do? What are the biggest things that we bring to the table with our kids for this kind of conversation? I would say two things. And I'm not going to rank them first and second because I really think they're two sides of the same coin. First is having a good relationship with your kids.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing that is going to give you more influence with your children than having a good relationship with them. The first part of any of this conversation, and my examples will be male biased because I have two sons, is going camping in the backyard with your kids, going to get a chili cheese dog, having a bedtime routine where you tell stories, wrestling in the floor and tickling and laughing. Those are things that there is nothing that we will talk about in terms of technology, in terms of resources, be that books or conferences or weekend getaways that
Right.
you can do. There is nothing that we will talk about that will replace a solid relationship with your kids where they enjoy you and you enjoy them.
Right.
Second thing that I would put out there in terms of that most valuable resource that we have as a parent in influencing our kid is our own failures. There is nothing more valuable in the discipleship of our children than how we handle our own failures.
Wow. Yeah.
Because that is the moment where I teach my kids that grace is good, that grace is safe. It's when I teach my kids what it is to be honest about my shortcomings without blame shifting, without minimizing, without this icky, sticky kind of shame-based, I have to wallow as I talk about this. It's a time when my kids learn the language of repentance.
Yeah.
I am convinced that kids do not say the words, I was wrong, for the same reason they do not say the word rhinoceros. They have never heard it used in a sentence.
Right.
And just the blessing of coming to my kids and saying, you know what, I lost my cool with you guys. I valued things moving in an orderly way and things being on schedule more than I wanted to honor you in that moment and it was wrong. That's something that I need to own and I need to work on, and I'm committed to doing that. Will you guys forgive me for the way I responded when we were late for church?
Hmm.
There is nothing more valuable in establishing a relationship where we're going to be able to talk about awkward things. My kids need to know where my impulse control is weak.
Right.
Is that with ice cream? Is that with um, a hobby that I have that I tend to give too much time to instead of committed to my family? They, those are safe conversations that I can introduce to my kids to say, this is a family where
Mm,
we are honest about our weaknesses and struggles.
that's
And
great.
so that fun side of building relationship and that honest side of acknowledging my struggles in ways that my kids are going to see anyway, that builds an atmosphere where a family can talk. That is, the technology is useful. It's why I'm so grateful for Covenant Eyes. There are great books and resources out there for parents, but nothing will replace those two things.
That's right. That's right. Oh, it's fantastic advice. So you're trying to lay this groundwork, and you did. It's interesting because you mentioned two critical things. You mentioned having a great relationship with your kids and enjoying them enjoying you, and then you also mentioned owning up to your own failures, speaking the language of repentance to them, and those are two kind of central pillars in this whole thing. What's interesting is you didn't mention anything in there about talking about sex or sexuality or any of the nuts and bolts or the information. Um, how much, especially when your kids are young, how much is information about sexuality helpful in preparing them for the world that this sexualized culture or the sexualized media that they could encounter? How much is information going to be important to them?
And I think that's where the relationship allows you to know your kids well enough
Sure.
to know what they're being exposed to.
Okay.
Again, depending on the school setting or homeschool setting that your kids may be involved with, who their friends are, what those social venues present, what things that they're exposed to within extended family relationships. Those are all things that are going to impact that and information that you're only going to get through time and relationship.
Right.
Um, Now, in terms of some of the logistics, I think just sitting down with your kids on the computer
Mm,
and explaining to them this is what the internet is. It allows you to see information and play games and interact with people in the kind of conversation that we're having right now, even though we're in two different states. And so when
right.
they talk to grandma on the computer, that is a time when you're teaching them the good uses of the computer and also letting them know that there's some dangerous, unpleasant stuff out there that they don't need to be exposed to. But having that time when you're having the conversation, and let's say it is a conversation with grandma over Skype, where the overall tone is positive, but you can offer a warning about the things that are dangerous, it allows that conversation not to be so heavy that it overwhelms your kids.
Mm, yeah.
It letting your kids play on the internet with you observing, taking them to a couple of game sites where they can play and click and asking them what kind of game it is that they want to play, showing them where the favorites are and putting some things on there so that in a supervised way that the computer is not a scary thing, that they can tell that you're not spooked by the computer as if it were something that was superstitious and awkward.
Right.
uh, that is part of establishing an environment where this is a comfortable conversation for your kids to have.
That's great.
Now, we begin to transition there, and we ask the question when it comes to talking about sex, and
Mm,
not just sex in terms of the mechanics and the birds and the bees, but lust and pornography. When do we begin to have that conversation with our
good. That's a
kids?
good question.
And I won't necessarily give an age as if we say, we need to have that at 6, 9, 12, 15. But in terms of some of those initial conversations, I will give a before and an after.
Okay.
Um, as a parent, I want to begin to have that conversation before they are having it with their friends.
Mm-hmm.
As a parent, I want to take advantage of that opportunity to be first.
Hmm.
There's I get when I do that, I get to choose the setting, the timing. I get to instill the language of what body parts are called and how they're referred to. I prevent my kid getting in a situation where their friends are introducing concepts to them that they don't have any frame of reference for. And that sense of ignorance on their part creates an insecurity and a fear where they feel like they have to go exploring for that information.
Hmm.
And so, knowing the peer settings that my kids are involved in, as uncomfortable as it is for a parent, okay, I want to know who's the first person that introduces my kids to cuss words.
Hmm.
And to let them know if you hear a word and you don't know what it means, come to me. And the first time they hear one of those 3 letter or 4 letter words coming to them, that is a time for me to set the tone of what my reaction is going to be.
Hmm.
Just thing that we don't say or do as a family. But as that begins to come into play, it's a sign that, okay, I need to be on guard for these conversations.
Right.
If with my sons, I begin to notice that instead of girls being different, they begin to become attractive. That as those conversations, if they say somebody's picking on them because they have a friend that they were talking to who was a girl at recess, that's a sign that sexuality is becoming more pronounced in their social environment.
Hmm.
And so those are opportunities that I want to have, and I want to have that conversation before their peers.
Right.
Now, when it comes to pornography and masturbation and some of those conversations, after they have their first wet dream, is a time that's a pretty good indicator. This is a conversation that I need to initiate with my sons.
Hmm.
It's a time when their body is maturing to a point that they want to know what just happened.
Yeah.
Why did that happen? Why might that happen again? Is this something I should be ashamed of?
Hmm.
Is this going to happen at some time when I don't know it's going to happen? What do I call what just happened? Uh, and usually, as a parent, if I'm doing laundry and making their bed and those kinds of things, I'm going to know when those events begin to occur. And so, some markers for those conversations would be I want to begin having that conversation before they're having that with their friends. And I want to know that after that initial wet dream or a few wet dreams that I begin to notice as a parent, those are times when I want to have these conversations.
Great. So now let's say that the parent has found evidence that their child, their son or their daughter, has been looking at pornography on the internet or maybe even through some other medium. They've been maybe through television or something, but they've been looking at pornography. Either there's been in one exposure or they know there's been several exposures to pornography on different occasions, and they found evidence of this in the computer. They found it in the history log, or they found it. Maybe they got a covenantized report, and they noticed that on the report, and they see that information. Now they wonder, how should I react to this? What should I do about this? I mean, maybe the parents hasn't even had, any good, birds and bees kind of conversations or any sort of mechanical conversation. What is sex or what is sexuality? And now their child is seeing this information for the first time in graphic visual form. What can a parent do in that instance? What's the proper way to react, and what kind of information do they need to impart to their son or their daughter?
Yeah, and I'll pick up on part of the question that I think is important. Um, Parents need to be technologically savvy enough
Yeah.
that they can check the history.
Yes.
And if the history is set to 0 days, they need to be able to check the cookies.
Yeah.
And if there's no cookies on their computer, they need to know that that's a problem
Yeah.
and that their kids have gotten savvy enough that they are beginning to cover their tracks. And so that day and age, and I'll show my age a little bit here, when we ask our kids to program our VCR because we don't know how to make it not blink 12, uh, we we have to be technologically savvy enough. And again, you can get online and say, how do I check the history? How do I check the cookies? How do I, where are those settings? Marking where your parental controls are so that if they get moved, that your kid's not saying, I had no idea. And you go, well, I guess maybe it moved its. No, parental controls don't move themselves.
Right.
Um, and the whole reason to have this part of the conversation is we want to discover if this is going on before we walk in on our child and the screen's coming down and their hands are moving and it's that awkward in the moment. I am having this conversation because I caught my child doing something, and the embarrassment and shame of that moment. I want to have covenant eyes on the computer so that I get a report that if something questionable is there, and I can think about this conversation before that moment. And so the first thing, and in some ways maybe that most important thing, is to not freak out. And it is painful, it is unsettling, it can be angering, it can be fear-provoking to think my child is looking at pornography. And so getting myself in check, talking to a spouse, talking to a youth minister, talking to somebody to go help me think through this conversation. After that, I want to do a little bit of research. I want to, whatever search engine that they may be using, I want to go to that search engine and just type one letter at a time, A. What comes underneath that may have been searched for under the letter A that lets me know what was my child looking for? Did they hear a crude word for sexuality at their school and they looked it up and that's where they got the information?
Or maybe did it autofill or something like that? Did it?
Right.
Okay.
And I use the autofill, which generally goes back to the most recent searches on my computer.
Sure.
Did they see a banner for Hooters and that's what they went for? Did they do they have a crush on a cheerleader and they typed cheerleader? It gives me something that as I go into this conversation, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to hear the words I don't know 36 times, that if I can ask a more leading, prompting question that says, I saw one of the things that you were searching for was about cheerleaders. What was it that gave you interest about that? That they don't have to be as volunteering of information. I can set a tone that says this is a safe conversation. I didn't say that in some awkward, overbearing way that that they don't know how I'm going to respond. I give them some of my tone to what they were looking for in the early part of that conversation. I think another important part of this is this should be a continuation of a conversation. All the conversations we were talking about just a moment ago about the conversations we have before they're having them with the kids and after wet dreams begin, and this should be a continuation where I can say, hey, this is something we've been talking about before. This isn't a fresh conversation. When we talked about lust and we talked about masturbation after you had your first wet dream, this is the kind of moment that we were expecting to come. Let's see this not as a new conversation, but as a continuation of what we were talking about before. In terms of maybe the resource that I have found most helpful for kids in this area, I really like the book by Joshua Harris, Sex is Not the Problem, Lust Is. There's a few things that I like about it. One is that it's a PG book on lust. And Josh is very clear up front that he is setting out to write a PG book on lust. There's some books out there, even those intended for kids, that as I read them and I think about going through them with my son, it's almost like sending them to an AA meeting the first time they get caught drinking. They're getting more education about what they experimented with that almost becomes a larger part of temptation then they're getting a preventative measure. I think Josh does a good job of that. I think Josh does a great job of putting an emphasis on the gospel and the heart more than behaviors and regulation. I think another part of this conversation is parents being able to talk about their own form of accountability. And not just sexual accountability, but my kids should know the guys in my small group that we go get breakfast on a regular basis and that whatever it is that we may be struggling with, and it may be impatience because of schedule, it may be making a priority of time for the family, that here are people that when things like this are going on in my life, this is who I talk to. Um, it And so I think as a parent, me having accountability relationships, and the fact that in our family, a lot of those are within our small group, that our kids go to our small group and they know Mr. Chris and they know Mike and Nate's their Sunday school teacher. And so that being a part of that conversation, that it's not that you struggle and I don't. It's not that I'm super dad and I have gone Teflon on temptation. Here are people that I talk to, and let me tell you some of the things that I talk with them about.
Right.
I think this is where the way that I compliment my wife is another huge part of this conversation. That to be able to ask, does what you see, is it consistent with the way that you see me taking care of your mom?
Hmm.
When you hear me affirm her, the things that I say that are good about her, when I tell her she is beautiful, does it sound and feel like the things that you saw on the computer or that you hear your friends talking about when you're at school?
Right.
And that sexuality is not something that is taboo, that they have to stay away from, but that the way that we do romance in our family, the way that I encourage them to compliment their mother, and I give them words to say about the things that we appreciate to her. And you need to go tell your mom that she's amazing, and we're grateful for this. That I am setting a tone for what male-female relationships ought to be like, so that there is something that makes them feel safe, something that they want, something for them to pursue, not just something for them to avoid.
Right. Oh, that's so good. So, as you're talking about, when I want to kind of rewind a little bit here about this whole accountability thing, modeling accountability for your child, letting them know what you're accountable, who you're accountable to, and the kind of conversations you have. I know for a lot of parents that we talk to, especially as they get into the discussion about pornography, many of these parents, especially dads that I talk to, they've got a pornography past. They've got issues from their own past. I mean, men and women I know are have been entrenched in pornography, or whether even things like promiscuity, premarital sex, or whatever in their teen years or in their 20s or whatever. They have experienced these things. They've done these things, and their question is, how vulnerable do I need to be with my child about these things? That's their first question. And second, I think for some parents, this is sort of a crippling fear for them. They don't feel like they can be the authority in these matters of sexuality because they feel like they botched it. They blew it when they were kids. They blew it when they were teens, and they're like, well, who am I to say anything to my teenager or to my kid that is dealing with these things when I was so pitiful at these things when I was their age. Who am I to talk about these things? So I guess there's two questions there. One is that sort of how do we get over that sense of a fear of wanting to talk about these things, or a fear of your own past. But second is, how much should I say? Should I talk about my past? Should I talk about what I've done or what I haven't done? Those sort of things.
And I'll touch on the first one that you mentioned there first. We are not the standard for our kids. And so when I talk to my kids about this is what is healthy and this is what is good, the fact that whatever it is I may have done that was knuckleheaded when I was a kid, or even as an adult, I'm not saying you have license to make every mistake that I made because I made them. That wouldn't be a very loving parent. Now, again, I don't want to hold the standard in this elitist, I'm above you kind of way. If I know this is a very hard area to keep that I've not been successful with. And when you talk about in our day and age, when many people do not marry until their mid to late 20s, and yet because of the onset of puberty, they are becoming lust is becoming more of a struggle in their early teens or even pre-teens, we've got a gap of a lot of years here when we need an open, honest dialogue. But the standard that I bring to them is not my own behavior. It's what God wants for them. God knows our weakness. He's patient with our weakness, but he also knows the dangers of our weaknesses, so he doesn't shy away from warning against them. And so that's the way that I think we engage that conversation. Now, in terms of how much we share, I think the guiding principle there is remembering my kid's not my accountability partner. I am my child's parent. I am sharing with them what is good for them. And if I withhold information that is not age appropriate for them, that is not being a hypocrite. That's being a mature parent who is weighing what is most age appropriate for my child in this moment.
Right.
And so if you're having the initial talk about sex, what it is, how it works, lust, and pornography, that is probably not the time to talk about whether you had premarital sex with your spouse when you were dating. Just doesn't fit that conversation. But I think in that conversation to say, I know how hard this is because I haven't handled this perfectly. And I want anything that you could learn from my shortcomings that makes this struggle easier for you. I want to offer that to you. And I want you to know that this isn't an area that I've been perfect. And so it's safe for you to come to me and say, I'm struggling or I've messed up. And so in that sense, I am sharing enough that I have given to my child what they need, which is a sense that I may not bat 1,000. And this is a safe conversation to have, whether I'm struggling or whether I failed.
Right.
If I've accomplished those objectives, then my history has done what my history needs to do at that stage in the conversation.
That's great. Great answer. So let's move this a step up. Let's say the parent finds out that the child has not just been incidentally exposed to pornography on the computer, or that they went looking for it once or twice, where they watched it for a couple minutes or clicked around for a few minutes. But they're noticing that this has gone much further than that. This is a habit. This is something they've watched on repeated occasions. It's happened over weeks or months, or possibly even, we're hearing stories of years where the parents have no clue that the child has been doing this for so long and has been entrenched in this. You got a child or a teenager who's into this. What do you say the parent's reaction to this needs to be?
And at this point, if you're learning that information, I'll go back to the initial piece of making sure you're in a good emotional spot to have the conversation. This is one where role playing and talking it through with some trusted people in your life who are not going to be points of embarrassment or shame for your child, so that, okay, I've responded to some of the points of resistance. I have had the person that I'm talking to sit with me in silence for a really long time, and I've had to think through, do I just keep talking and let this be a monologue, or how long do I wait in order to open this up as a dialogue? Chances are, if we're getting to this point, I need to have some facts in line. This is where having a Covenant Eyes report, knowing how to check the history and cookies on your computer becomes important. Because anytime we get caught in habitual sin, the human tendency, not the teenager tendency, the human tendency is to minimize. And so we need to have some facts so that we can have a conversation that actually fits the situation that's going on.
Right.
Now, I'll take a brief excursus here for a moment in terms of what I would see as maybe a standard development of the viewing of pornography. Generally, pornography begins with curiosity. Again, I want to know what the body of the opposite sex looks like.
Right.
I want to know what it looks like to have sex. I mean, how do the bodies go together and what do they do? And it is a visual curiosity that gets many people into pornography. If you will, they are going for some form of education. And I think one of the tragedies of our day is that pornography is the leading sex education for the young people in our culture.
Mm.
But I don't think it is visual curiosity or visual stimulation that keeps people and traps people in pornography. Um, Without trying to be crude, fat deposits at different points on our body just aren't that appealing for that long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the story. Pornography almost always has a story. Even if you take just print media pornography, rarely do they show a woman or a man in nude form with a blank background with very little expression on their face. They are doing something, they are inviting, they're in a location. And once you get to the video mediums of pornography, it is the story that becomes encapsulating. And this is where oftentimes, and I think it's to our culture's discredit, it is the mom having a conversation with the son. And there is a gender gap of the mom wondering how much can I relate to the male propensity to lust or to visual stimulation. Let me offer a parallel that I heard one person describe chick flicks as all having the same theme. And it is the girl as the central character and one or more guys doing everything that they can to win her attention, learning everything about her in order to woo her. And the movie is all about her and she gets to be a god. And that is the theme of every chick flick. I think that is also the theme of every pornography video. That there is one person who is getting to be the god. The members of the opposite sex or whatever gender that they happen to be attracted to are vying for their attention. And there are these elaborate stories with professional storytellers making up better stories than the individual sitting at the computer clicking the mouse feels like that they can make up for themselves. And there are professional actors bringing those stories to life with the kinds of bodies that they want to have and the kind of bodies that they want to partake of. And it is the story that they are placing themselves into. In the same way that when a little girl watches Cinderella and she wants the dress and wear the shoes and have the crown, and a little boy watches a baseball hero movie and he wants to be the one who hits the home run, we place ourselves in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the pornography industry, when it becomes entrapping, it is the story. And so when we have a conversation with our children about the objectification of the other gender, it's not just the visual objectification. It's that you exist to bring me pleasure. And I begin to expect a narrative of you. When I don't want my son, when he thinks of a wife, to think of a professional sex athlete, which is what a porn star is, a professional sex athlete. They work out, they train, they go to acting classes, they learn everything that they can to be a professional sex athlete. I want him to understand the danger that comes with that expectation of a wife. Now, again, I hope that's a conversation that I have with my son before any experimentation comes at a way that is age appropriate. And if there is experimentation, that is something that will make more sense to them, that we can come back to that what you're getting is a life partner to serve instead of a sexual slave to serve you and to fulfill all of your fantasies. And for them to again, hopefully see the relationship that I have with my wife
Yeah.
and go, what is it that makes that good? What is it that makes mom smile? What is it that makes me smile? And is there anything in what you're seeing in terms of that story that's becoming ideal that would lead you to think that you can get there through this being how you think about sex?
Mm-hmm.
And if you spend, as many young people can, 7, 10 hours a week, training yourself that this is what sex is, this is what it ought to look like. And you do that from the time you're 15 until you get married at 25. That's 10 hours a week. That's 5,000 hours a year over 10 years. That is, if my math is right, 50,000 hours of sex education in a particular story where it's not a husband loving a wife, but somebody partaking of a sex athlete fulfilling a script that they're just playing a role. When you go to love your wife for the first time, I don't want you to have 50,000 hours of obstacle to overcome to love her and experience what God wants you to have, and what I can tell you is truly amazing to be shared between a husband and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that kind of appeal is something that, if I have a good relationship with my son and he respects the way I love his mother, is something that he can resonate with, even if the snare of pornography has gotten a foothold that I wasn't aware of, and this conversation got much further, or this experience got much further down the line than I wanted it to before I began that conversation.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. I really thank you for elaborating on this, because I think we need to, as parents, help them to understand that pornography is not just a moral issue in the sense of there being a right and there being a wrong, but to see it in the context of the full story of who we are as people, who God is, who we are meant to be as human beings, and that pornography is telling that story. That it's not just what I like what you said there about it's not just the nudity that is appealing. It's actually the story that the picture is telling, the story that the video is telling. And I think by doing that, we actually help our children actually diagnose the anatomy of their own temptation. That they understand, oh, wait a second, I know why this is appealing to me now. And then to try to tell them, I guess, what would be a better story through the way you love their mother, through the way that the moms love their husbands, through the way that we talk about sex or marriage from a biblical perspective, that we just tell a better story. And I love what you're saying here about this. Just real quick as we wrap up, are there any good resources you could point people to help parents even learn that story for themselves? Because I think one of the reasons why the parents don't tell that story is because parents don't know that story. They don't, or at least they don't think in those terms. They don't necessarily know, well, how do I talk about sex as a good and wonderful and blessed thing in the context of marriage, and how do I talk about that story? How do I educate myself on that?
Yeah, and I think that aspect of story and that kind of thing is important. If the conversation I was just alluding to catches traction, then I think that is a great spot to begin to transition from a struggle with lust and pornography to dating. And the conversation about dating is not putting a Bible between you and the person that you're going on a date with so that you have to crawl all over Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in order to get to your girlfriend in the car, which is, I think, the way I remember pastors advising us. It's how do you date somebody to set up a relationship where you're saying, I'm interested in serving you for the rest of my life. And that's what it would mean. Now, in terms of some resources that would help parents, in terms of the overall gospel narrative, it may sound like a bit of an odd resource, but I really like this Jesus Storybook Bible by Sally Lloyd Jones.
No, that's a good one.
It is a children's Bible. It is one we started using with our boys when they were 2 and 3 years old. But in terms of showing the large picture of what Scripture is all about and how it centers on Christ and the gospel, it is a very readable. You can get through it in a couple of hours, front to beginning, and I think it is a wonderful introduction to the story of the gospel for anybody. Now, some other resources that may be a bit more particular, the Sacred Marriage by Gary Thomas. The premise of his book is, what if God meant marriage to make you holy more than to make you happy? Now, Gary is not at all against a happy marriage. If he was, he wouldn't sell any books. But his point is that God created marriage to shape our character more than just fulfill our desires. And it's only when our character has been shaped that we can really enjoy our desires instead of being run away with them. And so on the whole, I think it's a great book. And he's got a chapter in there on being sexual saints. And too often we treat those things as if they're different. Antonyms. There is that part of me that is sexual, that has desires, that looks at my wife and my eyes light up, and then God just has to kind of blush and turn his head when I do that. And then there's this part of me that's saintly when I read my Bible and I pray and I go to church. If we make those things separate, then we do ourselves a disservice. And so I think Gary Thomas does a great job in Sacred Marriage and in that chapter in particular. And I like Tim Chester's book on lust and pornography, Closing the Window.
That's very good.
And I think of the resources, I talked about Joshua Harris earlier as a resource for kids. If I had to pick one for adults, Tim Chester, Closing the Window, I think does an excellent job of not merely making the struggle with lust about logistics. Where do I place my computer? Who's my accountability partner? What software do I have on my computer? But also about understanding the gospel narrative and the empty promises that pornography offers me.
Yeah.
That until I see them as empty promises that are gospel alternatives, then in my moment of weakness, it's going to be very hard to resist.
Yeah.
And so those would be some resources that I think would hopefully serve people well.
That's great. Gary Thomas has got a new one out called The Sacred Search, which is the kind of the prequel, if you will, to Sacred Marriage. Now it's looking for looking for a spouse. How do you keep that holy versus happy, kind of purpose dichotomy in your mind? How do we, and I think the tagline to the book is, what if it's not about who but why? What if? So it's getting into the helping someone to think about dating or courtship or whatever from a biblical perspective, which is really neat. Thank you so much for.
If I can throw a plug for that book, my wife right now is leading a small group of young pros girls who are all in their early to mid 20s who are single, and that's this resource they're going through this summer.
Oh, great.
And they are loving that book. They are inviting friends and having them come and say, look, this is so helpful for us, and so absolutely I'd recommend.